everyone, my name is Casey Duplessis. I'm here from Counseling Services. I'm currently an intern over there. And I'm here today to talk to you about privilege. Kind of a hot topic button, especially around college campuses. And so I'm here to kind of give you what I know about it and kind of inform you about that. And I also want to know what you know about it and what you may think about this term. How do I skip? I don't know how to. Sorry, technical difficulties. There we go. All right, so here's my agenda. I plan on kind of talking to you about the history of privilege, where it started and began. I'll give you a few definitions of things that have to do with privilege, terms that you may commonly hear when privilege is talked about. I'll talk about bias and intersectionality theory. I will talk about why privilege and oppression is important to be educated about, especially today. I will discuss something called the addressing framework, which is a really good way to see where you lie and your identities and kind of explore further maybe how much privilege you do have or don't. And then I'll discuss a few next steps to take. So after we have learned more about privilege and discussed it, what do you do next? So the first definition I want to talk to you about is institutional power. It's the ability or official authority to decide what's best for others. Institutional power is also has to do with things like big schools or political power usually, or big work environments, corporations. It's the ability to decide who will have access to resources. So when you go and work for a company or you're part of a bigger institution like a school, there's perceived bias about who gets access to what resources, and those biases are things that I'm going to talk a little bit more about. It's the capacity to exercise control over others. So when you have big corporations, they have more power. It's just kind of what happens when corporations get bigger and people get more money. The second definition I want to talk to you about is prejudice. This is something that I'm sure you all have heard and I'm well aware of. It's a judgment or opinion that is informed on insufficient grounds before the facts are known or in disregard of facts that contradict it. They are learned and can be unlearned. So there is a preconceived notion that some prejudice cannot be unlearned. And those of you that are joining in on Zoom, your questions, if you have any questions, I will answer at the end. I can't actually access those when I'm giving the presentation, so I'll give some time at the end for that. The third definition is stereotype. What do we know about stereotypes? I'll leave that to my two audience members here. Don't speak at once.
Hello? Okay. They're not necessarily true. They're kind of just like societal's like thought on something, but I mean it's not like a real like representation of something.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, that's
Agreed.
about what I'd say.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, thanks. It's an exaggerated or distorted belief that attributes characteristics to members of a particular group. They lump them together and refuse to acknowledge differences among members of a group. So I will talk a little bit about that later, but an example of that is the way that I identify as female, and although I am female, there are lots of other parts of me that make up who I am and how I interact and perceive the world. The fourth definition is oppression. It's a combination of prejudice and institutional power which creates a system that discriminates against some groups, which are often called target groups, and they benefit other groups called dominant groups. Talk a little bit more about that in a few here. A bit more about privilege. It's a set of unearned benefits given to people who fit into a specific social group. The term unearned is kind of key here. It's easier to identify places in which you have experienced oppression before you've experienced privilege. So part of that has to do with negative bias. Being more aware of the negative things, that's a part of social construct and psychology theory. Why is it important to understand privilege and how it affects us? As human beings, we interact with other institutions and other groups. It's important for us to understand how privilege plays out because there are others, or ourselves, that reap the benefits of being born a certain way. On the other side of that, there are groups and people who are not afforded those same privileges. Wendy. I'm going to continue. What's that? All right, some history of privilege. Sorry. Some history of privilege is that privilege originated in the 1930s by a sociologist named W.E.B. Du Bois. He coined the term psychological wage. And as we know, what was going on in that time was a lot of African American or black versus white people. There was very much two different groups. White people who were lower wage earners and tried to kind of compare themselves to black people who were also making low wages. The reality of that is that white people or people with whiter skin had benefits that black or African American people didn't get at the time. So that's where this term was coined. It goes on and progresses into the 1980s with Kimberly Williams Crenshaw. She coined intersectionality theory. She kind of developed it. It's a study of how different power structures interact in the lives of minorities, specifically black women. The study of how overlapping or intersecting social identities, particularly minority identities, relate to systems and structures of oppression, domination, or discrimination. I have a video that hopefully can give you a little bit better idea of what privilege is.
I once saw a high school teacher lead a simple, powerful exercise to teach his class about privilege and social mobility. He started by giving each student a scrap piece of paper and asked them to crumple it up. Then he moved the recycling bin to the front of the room. He said, "The game is simple. You all represent the country's population, and everyone in the country has a chance to become wealthy and move into the upper class. To move into the upper class, all you must do is throw your wadded up paper into the bin while sitting in your seat." The students in the back of the room immediately piped up saying, "This is unfair." They could see the rows of students in front of them had a much better chance. Everyone took their shots and, as expected, most of the students in the front made it, but not all, and only a few students in the back of the room made it. He concluded by saying, "The closer you were to the recycling bin, the better your odds." This is what privilege looks like. Did you notice how the only ones who complained about fairness were in the back of the room? By contrast, people in the front of the room were less likely to be aware of the privilege they were born into. All they can see is 10 feet between them and their goal. Your job as students who are receiving an education is to be aware of your privilege and use this particular privilege called education to do your best to achieve great things, all the while advocating for those in the rows behind you.
What reactions did you have to the video, if any?
I had seen this video in, well, at least something similar in one of my sociology classes, and I thought it was a really good example because even in that class there were some people who didn't really understand privilege and why, like they're the type of people who wouldn't complain that they have the privilege they do, and also not accept the fact that there are people that didn't have that same privilege, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, so in some ways, I chose this video because it highlights the way that people in the front can often, they just don't understand that people in the back are throwing farther and they have less of an advantage, right? The people in the back can see it clearly, but the people in the front cannot. Often privilege, or the idea of privilege, raises defenses in people. It's a kind of a word that elicits a reaction, because it's hard to admit that we were born into a place where we have more privilege than others. And so that guilt is so often saturated in this idea of privilege and this conversations that involve discussing privilege, which makes it, I think, harder sometimes to navigate through it. So implicit bias is the attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understandings, actions, and decisions, or it's an unconscious thing. So if you look at the figure of the head with the iceberg, this is a lot of psychology here, but the bottom of the iceberg is in the water, and that's the unconscious, and the top is the more conscious part. Explicit bias is the top part, that's about 10%, and underneath is implicit bias. These are things that we aren't aware of, beliefs that we developed over time that we may not even understand. Sometimes the things that we do, the actions we have with our body, the way that we interact with others, we don't even think about until someone points it out. And when someone does point it out, typically it increases our anxiety because we're not aware of it. Causes shame as well, which is why our anxiety peaks. When we feel shame, we get anxious. We don't want other people to see that part. Implicit bias is pervasive. It's everywhere. Everyone has it. It's related to explicit bias, but it's distinct. They're two distinct mental constructs. Implicit bias helps us to generally favor our own in-group. So our own in-group being the people that we grew up around, the cultures that we grew up around, values that were perpetuated around us. Some research actually shows that we can hold implicit bias against our own in-group, but for the most part, it's in favor. They don't always align with our declared beliefs, so what we show outside, the explicit part. We may tell people we really value all these things, but inside, implicitly, we may feel differently, and we might not be aware of that. It's also malleable, meaning that it can be changed over time. These are the things that if we surround ourselves with different kinds of experiences, we can change these implicit biases we have. Are there any questions so far? Any comments? No? Okay. So these are different forms of oppression. Sexism, heterosexism, cisgenderism, to name a few. Are there ones on here that you two have maybe not seen before, or ones that you can add to this list?
I haven't seen before, but I think they're kind of self-explanatory if you just look at them.
Okay. Any questions you had on any of them? Have you heard of lookism before? So there's this psychology research that shows that people who are more attractive on the outside are afforded more opportunities and given more favor than people who may not. And our views and opinions of attraction obviously differ from the places that we are. If we're from a different country other than the United States, it would be much different. So, yeah. So is it possible to experience privilege and oppression at the same time? It is. Totally is. A common example that I hear is, I'm white, but I was poor, so therefore I'm not privileged. This isn't necessarily the case. You have whiter skin, which means that you're afforded institutional benefits for being white that people of color are not. Here's a quote by Phoenix Kalita. Privilege simply means that under the exact same set of circumstances you're in, life would be harder without your privilege. Being poor is hard. Being poor and disabled is harder. Being a woman is hard. Being a trans woman is harder. Being a white woman is hard. Being a woman of color is harder. Being a black man is hard. Being a gay black man is harder. What are some reactions you have to this? None? Okay. Here are some effects of privilege and bias. Privilege is blinding. So if you're in the front of the room and you're throwing paper into the trash, unless you look behind you, you're always going to be blinded to your own privilege. Sometimes when people in the back, they yell and they say, hey, you're more privileged, this isn't fair. You can hear it and you can see it, but you may not really understand it. You may not even choose to turn around all the way because of that shame. Sometimes we can't always see what we benefit from. Systemic oppression. So many people are not afforded the same opportunities for jobs, healthcare, education, safety, and more. This is kind of a lot about, kind of wraps up in what I've been talking about. In jobs, women are not paid as much as men. We know this. This is part of research. It's also harder for somebody who has an African American name to get an interview than somebody who has a more white or Caucasian sounding name. These are just some of the examples. Also education. We're privileged to be educated because education costs a lot of money. Not everyone is afforded the opportunity to apply or get into college. Safety is also a privilege, and it's also a systemic oppression. When institutions have power, the bias continues. Sometimes institutions don't always know that they have power. When they become aware of it, they deny it because nobody wants to admit that they have power and that they may have been using that power to oppress other people. This is an example. Here's a cisgender, able-bodied, straight, rich, white man. Someone who's born with lots of privilege, and he's saying, why are you complaining? I've got a burden too. His backpack look as heavy as the others. What expression is everyone wearing in this? Anger. They all look angry, yeah. Makes it kind of hard to have conversations, huh? This is a quote by Malcolm X. Power in defense of freedom is greater than power in behalf of tyranny, oppression, because power, real power, comes from our conviction which produces action, uncompromising action. Has anyone heard this quote before? What reactions do you have to it? Okay. We'll move on. Here are some of the realities of privilege. It's in our day-to-day lives. Every day. We're surrounded by privilege. Even if we're not aware of it, even if we don't think about it, we're surrounded by it. We have it in some way or another. Some have more privilege than others. An example is that some people walk down the street without experiencing gender-based harassment. That's an example of privilege. Not everybody experiences that. Somebody who doesn't experience being harassed on the street may think that it's just expected, that you get to walk down the street and nobody harasses you. It's not until somebody speaks up about it and says something about it. But when we speak up about it, we often speak up about people's inner beliefs and values and what they know about the world, which is conflictual, which is kind of what causes this reaction from people and this shame. Privilege doesn't mean your life is easy or that you didn't work hard. It simply means that you don't have to face the obstacles that others have to endure. You can have privilege and have worked hard. It's just different for somebody who doesn't have as much. This is the addressing framework that I mentioned earlier. It's by a researcher. Last name is Hayes. And addressing stands for a few different things, and I've listed them on the left. And so what I've done is I've listed the left, which is my information, my identities, and I've listed on the right examples of privilege. So a few different examples of privilege is being white, is being able-bodied, is being heterosexual, is being a man. It's also being Christian, middle or owning class people, middle-aged people, and English-speaking people. So I'm 26, I'm a millennial, which means that sometimes I don't get as much credibility as middle-aged individuals might. It becomes more difficult when I'm being a therapist or something like that. That's when I experience that. Another age that experiences oppression and doesn't have as much privilege as seniors or those typically over the age of 60. They also get discredited. I don't have a disability. My religion is Christian. My ethnicity is Latina. So that is something that I don't experience a ton of privilege in. However, I am a very light-skinned Latina. So in the Latina culture or population, my light skin affords me more privilege than people who have darker skin. My social class is middle. That's fluctuated throughout my life. I'm heterosexual, no indigenous background. I was born in the United States, and my gender is female. So really, when you look at it, pretty privileged. I'm also educated. I say this, and I'm kind of talking about this in hopes that talking about my own privilege will help decrease the anxiety or shame behind talking about your own privileges, because these are conversations that need to be had. Does anyone have any questions or reactions to this?
I come across a lot of people who, a lot of white people will say, but I worked hard for what I got, so stop telling me I'm privileged. A few weeks ago, there was a girl on my Facebook who said the same, like had a whole status about how, like, yeah, I'm white, but stop calling me privileged, it's mean. And like my comments were basically what you've been saying, like, I'm not saying you didn't work hard, but getting those jobs that you worked hard at were easier for you than they would be for someone whose name doesn't sound as white as yours does, and stuff like that. And it's hard to get people to understand that without them thinking that you're like attacking them or saying that they're not working hard.
Yeah, that's a really good example. I've also come across that a couple times. I think it can be really hard when you say to somebody you have privilege, because a lot of people take it on as a personal attack. It questions their beliefs and what they know about their world, and it shakes things up. And whenever we have conflict and we shake things up in our own world, there's a lot of anxiety and shame that comes from that. My ethnicity, my Latina ethnicity, is different in different areas that I've lived in. So in Seattle, I was brown, and so I was not a part of this white culture. I didn't experience a lot of privilege in that area of my life. When I went to Southern California, I was white. I was white. No matter who I spoke to, I was white. And so it was weird and different. And I definitely got more defensive because I was trying to own this Latina part of my heritage, but also being told by people who were Latina or Latino that I was not. So, any other reactions or comments? This is just a way for you all to explore a little bit more about your identities. Maybe become a little bit more aware of the privileges that you may have. This is a video from BuzzFeed, but I don't know if anybody has done this before, this activity, but everyone starts in a line and they step forward if they can agree with the statement, and usually the statement has something to do with privilege. So I just thought I would play this, and we can talk about reactions that you have about it afterwards.
Some people are born into families where they have to walk miles just to get water. All I have to do is turn on a faucet. That's privilege.
I think privilege is when some people have some things and other people don't have things.
I feel privilege is something that you don't even really have control over.
I think it'd be silly for me to say I don't have a fair amount of privilege, considering like the country I live in and the job I get to do and the college I was allowed to go to.
I suppose being a white male will help me end up somewhere towards the front, but I'll take a few steps back from being gay.
I don't think I'll make it to the front. I think I'll maybe be in the middle. That's just the gut feeling I have.
If your parents work nights and weekends to support your family, take one step back. If you can show affection for your romantic partner in public without fear of ridicule or violence, take one step forward. If you were embarrassed about your clothes or house while growing up, take one step back. If you have ever been diagnosed as having a physical or mental illness or disability, take one step back. If you've ever been bullied or made fun of based on something you can't change, take one step back. If you get time off for your religious holidays, take one step forward. If you came from a supportive family environment, if you can see a doctor whenever you feel the need, if you are able to move through the world without fear of sexual assault, if you took out loans for your education, if there were more than 50 books in your house growing up. So these are your final positions.
I think it felt kind of strange for everyone.
It's a hard thing to discuss or even reflect on.
It was very awkward. I think when you can represent it so visually like this and so immediately, it definitely takes on a new form.
I think we were like all joking around in the beginning. It was pretty lighthearted, and as soon as the questions started coming in, the mood shifted immediately, and we all it was just silent.
Just looking back and seeing like a bunch of people behind you is not a good feeling.
It's like weird how you want to like hold on to explaining a certain privilege, like, oh, but that's not actually me because like I had to work really hard for that. So it's weird to like take a step forward when you feel like you're taking a step forward with someone else, but you wear a lot of the baggage of like how those things were hard.
It was like more emotional than I thought it would be.
It reminded me of when they talk about slavery in high school and you feel like angry for a few days, but then you just realize like this is how it is.
For me, it was kind of frustrating almost to look back and see how much further some people were behind me, and realizing that, you know, a lot of that stuff, no amount of hard work or even legislation can make up that gap.
It's interesting being an Asian American because you're not really sure where you fall on the spectrum of privilege.
I know that for me, one of the reasons I ended up so far back was that there were questions around safety as an African American, as a woman, as a gay woman. There are just so many different ways that I don't feel safe.
I feel like I just learned to be grateful for what you have. You know, we're in such a huge society where it's always complaining about what you don't have. It just shows you that for some families, like each family, you're meant to do better. My grandparents did good, my parents did good, and I'll do even better.
I do think if you're not like aware of privilege, you should do this exercise, but it's more complicated.
What reactions did you have?
I think it was a really good representation of like, if you think you have it like bad, there's people that have it way worse than you, and to be like thankful that for what you have, and also be just aware of like the struggles other people are going through, because I think ignoring that privilege does exist and that like it's a real thing in the world is making it like even worse. And so I think it's cool that they brought light to that. And I think, I don't know if it was just like the people in there, but I know that like once people that were farther up on the line, when they realized like how far up they were and their friends that were farther back, like they weren't like, oh, like, yeah, like they weren't like offended. They're like, oh, like I realize this is a real problem. Like I didn't realize that some of my close friends were affected by this. And I think it just like, I don't know, if we took that approach, I feel like it would open other people's eyes. Kind of think it's cool.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, thank you. I think one of the things that stands out to me is kind of that sitting at the front of the class and never looking back at the other people who are also throwing balls. And so this, an activity like this really requires that you look back and that there's one shot where like one of the people are letting go of the hand of the person behind her. And I think that impacted me. It's kind of along those same lines of understanding that there are people still back there. Kind of opening your eyes to that. Any other thoughts about this? Yes. 1 second. Yes, please.
So I used to teach Intro to Women's Studies.
Yeah.
And I used this privilege walk every semester. During the beginning of the semester, we would start talking about privilege, and I always go out there and do it right outside here at Leisure. And then we would go back inside the classroom and process it and have a discussion, after we finished. And every single semester, my students were always surprised at where they were, in the space after it happened. And it served as a really good way to start off our semester with the understanding of how deeply ingrained privilege is within our society and how we ignore privilege when we are privileged. So I think this is a powerful exercise and really does help people understand that, I don't even recognize that having more than 50 books in my house is something that not everybody experiences in their lifetime. And I think that's one of the ones that a lot of students really are like, that doesn't even make sense to me. How can somebody not have 50 books?
Right.
And that's actually one of my favorite ones of this, is because I think it really does help people understand that whole concept of how privilege is so prevalent and we choose to ignore it because it doesn't make any sense to us if it's not there.
Do you think that your students initially, you said they were surprised, do you think that they thought that they were going to be farther behind or farther forward?
They thought that like everybody was pretty much going to remain equal the entire time.
Yeah.
So.
Okay. Yeah, I know I've been a participant in these, and I've also observed some of them, and I know that that's also something that I've seen, is that people often think that it's going to be the same because we, as human beings, think that others are also have our same experience. I know that there's a lot of people also that think that they're farther behind, and so it can be jarring to know that they have so much more privilege and weren't aware of that. Yeah.
I think another interesting thing about this exercise is that, I think a lot of times when people talk about privilege, it's you either have it or you don't. And in this case, there's different levels, and you can see that, you can be, it's kind of like it's like its own spectrum of where you're at on that. So that's just interesting to see.
Yeah, there's something, I think that there's something a little bit more accepting about everybody having privilege and not just you have privilege and I don't. Because I think that's sometimes what isn't talked about is that everybody does have privilege in some form or capacity. Typically, I use that term loosely, not everybody, but everybody typically in America does. For example, I'm privileged in my education, but I'm not privileged in my gender. So, good stuff. So, let's talk about what you can do. So there's guilt that comes up and shame that comes up, and it causes us to be really reactionary. Causes anger, which typically isn't a very good way to have conversations with other people. Talk about others who experience privilege and about how privilege exists. Work in solidarity with oppressed groups. When you're made aware of your bias, listen. Apologize, although I have a reaction to that apologize one. I think if you over apologize, then it defeats the purpose. Act accountably and act differently going forward. Here are some resources on campus. If you want to know more about any of this, or if you want resources. This last part is about becoming an ally. The person who's committed to dismantling oppression and is reflected in a willingness to do the following. So educate yourself, educate yourself, educate yourself. Don't just stop with a cat chat about privilege. Go on and do research in the library, do research on the internet. It's everywhere. Privilege is a hot topic right now, so it's a great time to really get all the information that you need to teach yourself. Take classes. Learn and listen to people that are targets of oppression. I don't know if any of you enjoy slam poetry, but that's a great way to learn more about oppression. Examine and challenge your own prejudices and stereotypes and assumptions. Talk to other people about your privileges and what it's like to talk about those. Defensiveness, I think sometimes it gets a bad rap. When people say you're defensive, it's like insulting, but really our defenses are protections, typically, from guilt and shame. Learn and practice the skills of challenging oppressive remarks, behaviors, policies, and institutional structures. I don't have enough time to cover microaggressions in its full capacity, but understand microaggressions, talk about them, have a listening ear for them because they're everywhere. Understand ways in which you are successful in challenging other people's oppressive remarks. It's important. I have merit and credibility amongst other women. So when I talk to other women about this issue, it's different than I would be as a man. I have similar identities. So that's why it's so important to talk to people in your family, in your groups. When you have similar identities to other people, you tend to have more merit. Act collaboratively with members of the target group to dismantle oppression. Some ways to increase your awareness. The addressing framework that I presented about a couple slides back is a great way to increase your own awareness of where you lie and how much privilege you have. There's a project implicit bias test. If you Google that, it's awesome. It can help you identify how much bias you actually have. Talk about it. I said earlier that implicit bias is malleable. It is malleable when you talk about it and when you surround yourself with things that are different from maybe the way that you grew up or what your normal environment would be. It's a BuzzFeed privilege checklist. That's also great. Check that out. And like I said earlier, continue your own research. The great thing about being a part of an institution like K-State is that there's a lot of conversations happening about this stuff. And if it's not happening around you, all you have to do is look a little tiny bit to find it. One last image for you. The big fish sees that the world is just, and the little one doesn't experience it that way. What questions do you have? What reactions do you have? Wendy, how do I... I'm good? Okay. Thank you very much.